Welcome back to another Explainer. Today, we're setting off on a seriously epic journey through the tumultuous and honestly truly fascinating history of Madagascar. We're talking about a story filled with incredible biological wonders, fierce ancient kingdoms, brutal colonial struggles, and a modern-day fight for survival. This isn't just a history lesson, you guys. It's a masterclass in how geography literally shapes destiny. So let's dive right in. If we really want to understand Madagascar, we've got to wrap our heads around this massive central paradox. Think about this. For more than 70 million years, this giant landmass just sat there, completely isolated in the Indian Ocean. And that profound isolation, well, it was its greatest blessing. It created this absolutely unbelievable sanctuary for life that you can't find anywhere else in the universe. But as human history sped up and global power started expanding, that exact same isolation turned into a systemic curse. It left the island uniquely vulnerable in ways that we're still seeing play out today.
Section 1. The Island of Extremes. Before we get into all the kings, queens, and colonial empires, let's just set the physical stage for a second.
Wrap your mind around this number for a minute. 226,658. That is the square mileage of Madagascar. It's huge. It's the fourth largest island on the planet, trailing only Greenland, New Guinea, and Borneo. We're talking about a landmass stretching 1,000 miles from north to south. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. Despite having this massive coastline, it's pretty much surrounded by these jagged coral reefs, so it has surprisingly few good natural harbors. Combine that with a vast upland central plateau that averages right around 3,200 feet above sea level, and you essentially have a geographic fortress, a fortress that naturally kept the rest of the outside world completely at bay for millennia.
And the biological result of that fortress-like geography, it's genuinely astonishing. Nearly 90% of Madagascar's flora and fauna are entirely endemic, meaning they're found here and absolutely nowhere else on Earth. Nowhere. We're talking about those iconic giant baobab trees and, of course, the incredibly diverse lemurs. Because of this ancient geological isolation, evolution basically got to run its own grand, undisturbed experiment, totally separate from the mammals and predators that were evolving right next door on the African mainland.
Moving right along to Section 2, first settlers and cultures. So the stage is perfectly set, but what about the humans? Honestly, one of the greatest mysteries in history is why such a massive, resource-rich island stayed completely uncolonized by humans for so long. And the story of who finally did arrive, it's a spectacular display of maritime skill. These people didn't just casually walk over from the mainland. The very first settlers were Austronesian peoples who showed up around 500 BCE. They traveled thousands of miles across the ocean from Southeast Asia in outrigger canoes. Then, much later, around the 13th century, Bantu migrations brought people across the Mozambique Channel from the African coast. So you get this incredibly unique Afro-Asian melting pot. Today, the Malagasy nation is actually made up of 18 distinct ethno-linguistic groups. They all share this common ancestral root, but they each bring their own incredibly rich, specific cultural traditions to the table.
Now, as these societies grew more complex, their culture really deepened. A huge part of this was something called kabari. Kabari is this traditional verbal art form. Think of it as a highly poetic, almost operatic style of speech. They used it for everything: debates, high-stakes politicking, and honoring their ancestors. What I find so fascinating here is that when European missionaries eventually showed up and introduced the Latin alphabet, the Malagasy elites didn't just abandon Kabari. Not at all. They cleverly layered their traditional oral rhetoric right alongside this new written alphabet to project their power and keep their culture incredibly strong.
Which brings us to Section 3, Kingdoms and Fierce Resistance. Let's talk about the rise of indigenous power.
Specifically, we need to talk about the formidable Merina Kingdom, which emerged right out of that central plateau we mentioned earlier. Starting in the 18th century, the Merina people began this rapid, highly organized political unification. They built smart agricultural water control systems and created a really powerful meritocratic bureaucracy. By the 1820s, they officially set up a permanent seat of power at Antananarivo. They expanded across the island using a really strategic system of indirect rule over the groups they conquered. But as European powers started circling the island in the 19th century like sharks, the Merina Empire had to pivot. They shifted from rapid expansion to fierce, desperate defense. And that era eventually ended with the French capturing the capital in 1895.
But right in the middle of that timeline sits someone you absolutely need to know about: Queen Ranavalona I. She came to power in 1828, right when fears of British and French annexation were at a fever pitch, and she took a seriously hard-line stance to protect her island's sovereignty. She fiercely curbed European influence, she kicked out foreign missionaries, and she laid down draconian laws to keep total control. Now, on one hand, her actions absolutely worked. She kept European empires at bay for decades. But the internal cost? It was devastating. Her incredibly harsh policies against local merchants and lenders triggered a severe economic decline, agricultural collapse, and massive famines. It's just a stark, heavy example of the impossible choices leaders faced when trying to survive in the age of global imperialism. All right, Section 4, the French colonial era. Eventually, that fortress-like isolation was breached. Jumping to the late 19th century, European colonial forces finally overwhelmed the island's defenses. But here's the thing. Even after the capital fell in 1895, the Malagasy people did not go quietly. At all. The Menalamba revolt kicked off, and it was this fierce, deeply rooted anti-colonial resistance movement. We're talking regular citizens, former soldiers, and rural farmers violently pushing back against the occupying forces. The leaders of the revolt were eventually defeated, sure, but this intense resistance proved a massive point. Controlling the island on a piece of paper in Europe was vastly different from actually controlling it on the ground. In fact, the reality of colonial rule created this bizarre, stark divide. The French administration set up what we call a formal colonial economy, right? It had strict property rights on legally recognized lands. But they completely failed to overpower the local traditions. So this massive shadow economy just thrived right alongside it. Locals kept using their own flexible, unregulated systems for land tenure and timber harvesting. The colonial administrators simply didn't have the manpower or infrastructure to stop it. So the massive French colonial machine was basically forced to coexist with a local economy it couldn't understand and definitely couldn't control. And then global politics threw a massive wrench into everything. World War II violently dragged Madagascar right back onto the world stage. After France fell, the island actually came under the control of the pro-German Vichy regime. This sparked a massive refugee crisis as people fled other war zones. And it got so tense that in 1942, the British launched a full-scale invasion at Sorrento just to stop the island from becoming an Axis naval base. For the Malagasy people, this entire era was an absolute nightmare. It brought widespread famine, extreme malnutrition, and completely upended the social order. I mean, suddenly the wealthy French planters were being demoted and ordered around by occupying British forces. Which brings us to our final chapter, Section 5, Independence and Modern Challenges. So the end of World War II sparked this huge wave of desire for self-determination across the globe, and Madagascar was right there in the mix. On March 29, 1947, this massive, totally spontaneous uprising erupted against French rule. What's crazy about this is the sheer asymmetry. You had local rebels using scavenged, leftover weapons with basically zero military training going head-to-head with a highly sophisticated French military machine. The uprising was suppressed, brutally, but the global sympathy it sparked was undeniable. It made it crystal clear that the era of unquestioned colonial rule was rapidly coming to an end. They did finally win that push for sovereignty, gaining full independence in 1960 under their first president, Philibert Tsiranana. But man, the political evolution from there was a rocky road. That initial burst of hope soured pretty fast. By the 1970s, the country had slid into this harsh period of dictatorship and rigid state control over the economy. It actually wasn't until 1989, after years of mass protests and crushing economic pressure, that they finally, turbulently, transitioned into a multi-party democratic system. And here is where we bring it all together, because that core paradox we talked about at the very beginning, it absolutely persists today. Think about it. Madagascar is ridiculously rich in biodiversity, mineral wealth, and agricultural potential. Actually, back in the 80s and 90s, they were hitting an impressive 5% economic growth rate. But despite all that abundant wealth, relentless political crises, disputed elections, and a crippling lack of infrastructure keep the nation trapped near the very bottom of the UN Human Development Index. It's a land of plenty where the vast majority of people are forced to live in extreme poverty. And this is exactly why this matters for every single one of us. Because the very isolation that created Madagascar's unbelievable biodiversity, those lemurs, the ancient baobab forests, is actively being dismantled. Extreme poverty is driving desperate slash-and-burn agriculture. Because of that, 70% of the natural forest has already been deforested. 70%. On top of that, rampant shadow economies are exploiting resources totally unregulated, while political instability and electoral fraud just block any kind of meaningful, long-term environmental or economic reform.
So we're left with this really profound question to chew on. Can Madagascar's deeply rooted resilience outlast its current ecological and political turmoil? I mean, this island survived 70 million years of total isolation. It survived the brutal rise and fall of empires, and it survived the crushing weight of colonialism. But these modern threats, the rapid deforestation, the political gridlock, they pose a completely new kind of existential danger. It's this incredibly complex, unfolding story of an island standing right on the brink. And however this plays out, it's going to determine the ultimate fate of one of the most unique, irreplaceable environments on planet Earth. Thanks for hanging out with me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.